then in my the YouTube, right, I go live. Okay, you click the YouTube. Can you see the WebEx?
YouTube.
Now I will give access to Angela to be the presenter. Okay. Hi, Angela.
Hi. So,
Hi, Angela. Please share your slides from your end.
yeah, sure. You can hear me fine, right? Hello? Can you hear me?
You will, yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yes, Angela.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I should be fine. I'm gonna close all the windows. I don't overwhelm. Yeah, everything okay? Did I stop sharing?
Yeah, everything is fine. You can just leave it as it is.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have 15 minutes more to start. Silen?
Yes, Stella.
Silen, everything okay from your side?
Yeah, I checked from YouTube. Yeah, it's okay. It's fine. Then
Can see
remember
the
to
slide,
record.
right?
Yes, I can see. I can see. Remember to record the WebEx.
Okay. Okay, now I will actually recording is already in progress now.
Okay, okay. Now you can leave it.
Recording. Yeah, okay, Angela. So we are good now. We already set up everything. We got 15 minutes. You can have your break and then come back like 5 minutes before we start. All
Okay.
right. All the best, Angela. All
Thank
the
you.
best.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And nice to meet you, Satya.
Yeah, Silen, yeah, Angela. Hi, nice to meet you, Angela.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So
Stella,
I'll go for 10 minutes and just like have, I don't know, cracker.
Yeah. Yeah, 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay. 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 All right.
Stella, can you log Angela view for everyone?
Okay. எப்படி Silen? எப்படி?
From the WebEx?
எங்க?
From the WebEx, can you on top of the Angela view, Angela video?
Yeah.
Can you
Okay.
see the log participants view for everyone up to you?
Okay, I lock already. Can you see?
You log for everyone, right?
Yeah, I lock for everyone. And the 3 dot ல போயிட்டு lock participant for this location.
Yes, correct. Then you choose Angela, right?
Yes, I choose Angela. Can you see now? அவங்களோட இதுல அந்த lock இது இருக்கு.
Okay. Yes, I can see now.
Okay, Silen. Okay.
Okay. So
Okay,
we can
Silen. Then we see
leave
one about 9 to 9:05 you stand by. If everything okay, then it's fine, Silen. Yeah.
Okay, Stella.
All right. See you guys.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Silen.
Is my video okay? I'm not like too close to the screen or something. It's fine, right?
Okay, let me see the live streaming.
I'm
Keep talking.
It's okay?
Keep talking.
So non-tariff measures, exporters margins, yay.
Yeah, video is okay. No problem.
Okay. All right.
Hi, Angela. Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Shafan. I think she just stepped out. We just
Oh,
scan
okay.
all the setting for the live streaming and recording and everything.
Mm.
Please also join in their YouTube link and see if everything is okay.
Okay, I'll do that.
So are you moderating, Shafan?
Yes,
Okay, I'm sending you the survey link here.
yeah.
Okay, I just sent in the chat box.
Mm. Mm. Okay. Great.
Good morning, Chef.
Hi, Angela. Good morning. How are you?
Good, and how are you?
Good. There's some echo.
Right. So that was happening yesterday as well. Like,
Stella, can you try to mute and see if the echoes from your side? Yeah, I think now, Angela, can you say something?
yeah. How is this? Is this much better?
Yeah, I think it was.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Yesterday was
think now
happening
it's
as
clear
well.
as well.
Sorry?
Okay. Okay, so it's not me, right?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I think it's good now. I wanted to ask, how do you pronounce your last name? Is it Montfaucon?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Everybody asks that. Yeah, Montfaucon.
Hmm. Yeah, I didn't want to try before. I didn't want to say it in the introduction without checking with you.
Yeah, no worries.
So it is around 40-45 minutes of presentation followed by Q&A.
Yeah.
Is it okay if there are some clarifying questions? I usually ask people to send it to me in private. So is it okay if I interrupt you?
Yeah,
Or
sure. Please.
okay.
Yeah, I think 40 minutes of me just talking, maybe you don't get tired of my voice. That's fine, you can interrupt.
Okay, great. So let's wait for 1 minute and then we will start. Okay, so let's start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the seminar series of the World Bank Research Center in Kuala Lumpur. Today, we have Angela Faith Montfaucon, who is a young professional at MTI Global Practice at the World Bank. She will present her very insightful work on the effects of non-tariff measures and basically the effects of those measures on different margins of international trade. The talk is 45 minutes long, which will be followed by a Q&A session. If you have any clarifying questions that need to be asked during the talk, please send them to me privately, and I'll ask them at an opportune time. Also, I'll be sending out a link for survey for this, which helps us improve and maintain the quality of our seminars at the end of the seminar. This is also being live broadcasted on YouTube. So if you have any questions for the YouTube watchers, you can also mention them in the comment section there. Hi, Angela. Welcome to our seminar series. Please start at your convenience.
Okay. Hi, Shafat. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening. Thanks a lot for having me. This is work that I'll be presenting, as Shafat mentioned, on non-tariff measures and how they may affect exporters' margins using evidence from Indonesia. And it's work that I've done with my colleague, Massimiliano Kali, who isn't here today because he's in Europe. But it's our first time presenting this work, so we're really looking forward to your comments, questions, and suggestions. So to start off, we want to talk about import competition, because the core of this analysis is we're looking at how non-tariff measures may affect exports through import competition. So as you know, the wave of trade liberalization in the 80s and 90s induced increased competition from imports for domestic incumbents in most countries. And ex ante, the relationship could be theoretically ambiguous, but what we know from the literature is that lower import competition, or lower competition in general, can reduce exports by stifling productivity, enhancing investments. And as productivity declines, we can expect to see the probability of exporting also declining. And another way is lower competition could actually increase domestic markups relative to markups in the export market. And if that's the case, then firms could be induced to start supplying the domestic market at the expense of their export activities. On the other hand, if joint economies of scale exist between export and domestic sales, then we could actually see higher competition negatively affect exporting activities. And this has been modeled in some of the work that's been cited here. So all of this to say is that theoretically, it's not clear cut, but we can expect this sort of positive relationship in general between competition and exporting. And all of these channels could lead to this relationship positively affecting exports at both the intensive and the intensive margins. So why non-tariff measures? Well, non-tariff measures are now the new phase of trade policy. And to the extent that non-tariff measures and their introduction and their increased use could reduce import competition, that makes it very relevant for an analysis such as this. So with trade agreements, and as I mentioned, trade liberalization in the last couple of decades, governments have had less room to affect competition at home by changing import tariffs. At the same time, non-tariff measures have become a more prominent policy tool. And although in many cases these measures do achieve legitimate non-trade objectives, such as protecting consumers' health and safety, some non-tariff measures appear to be more protectionist in nature, and their impact could potentially be more keen, if not even more adverse than that of tariffs. Indeed, the Global Trade Alert, reports that, and here they just look at trade restrictive measures, but even then they report that since 2009, trade restrictive measures or interventions worldwide that are due to tariffs are only about 20%, but those that are due to non-tariff measures are nearly 3 times that of tariffs. So in essence, what we're saying is that non-tariff measures have become even more important in this sort of trade liberalization era, which has mostly focused on import tariffs. And so then why Indonesia? So 2 key reasons why Indonesia makes for this case study even relevant and interesting. The first one is that non-tariff measures in Indonesia have been increasing in the past couple of years. So the chart that you see on your left is the evolution of sort of the broad measures of NTM. So these are your sanitary measures and technical barriers to trade and inspection measures. But whether we're looking at the frequency or coverage ratios, we can see that in general, there's been sort of an increase in all of these sort of NTM coverage and frequency ratios. And when we try to compare Indonesia to other countries in the region, we also find that Indonesia ranks among the higher countries in terms of, the NTM usage in the region. So that's the chart on the right. When we're looking at just NTMs in general using the WITS database, Indonesia is the highest in the region except for the Philippines. So this makes NTMs quite important for a country such as Indonesia. And the second key reason is on exports. So why are we looking at how NTMs affect exports, especially for a country like Indonesia? And the main reason there is that export performance in Indonesia has been relatively weak. So the export performance, if we just look at the exports to GDP ratio, has been worsening since 2000. And on the chart on the left, Indonesia is at red line right at the bottom there. So not only is it very low, but it's also been declining compared to other countries in the region, with a little bit of an exception during the commodity price boom. But where this has been most evident in the manufacturing sector, and that's the chart on the right, where we see sort of competitiveness in the sector using the share in manufacturing exports. And again, we can see that towards the latter years, Indonesia is the lowest, second only to the Philippines again. So this makes it even although exports in themselves are an important outcome, but also exports are inherently linked to the productivity of the firm. So this is something that's quite important for Indonesia as a country and for exports sort of in a broader sense. So what do we do? The key research question that we ask is, how do non-tariff measures affect firms' export performance through this import competition channel that I mentioned? And how we try to answer that is by doing 2 things. First is by addressing the key limitation when it comes to analyzing NTMs, and that is NTMs are hard to measure. And to try to address that, we merge 2 main sources of data. The first data is on the universe of Indonesian exporters, and the second data is a new and time-varying data set of NTMs at the most disaggregated level applied to Indonesian imports. And I will explain a little bit more about this data sets a bit later. And then we assess how NTMs affect firm performance, regardless of whether a firm imports the specific good. And here what we are saying is that if a firm exports a specific, let's say, HS10 product, and that HS10 product is also subject to NTMs when it's being imported, then, in principle, we're expecting that the competition for that good is less domestically, whether or not it is that firm that imports that good or not. So even if the firm is not importing directly, the very fact that they are trading in this particular good then means that if there's trade distortion and the imports are reduced for that good, then that reduction in competition will affect this firm. And then the second thing that we do is we identify 4 sets of non-tariff measures. And again, I will go into a little bit more detail on how we do that. But the selected NTMs are, pre-shipment inspections, which are, mass classification is C1, restrictions on port of entry of imports, mandatory certification with SNI, so those are the national standards, and import approval requirements. And to quickly summarize what we find that an increase in a firm's exposure to each of these 4 non-tariff measures is associated with a decrease in the survival time of firms in the export market, but also a negative impact on other extensive margins and the intensive margins. So it leads to, for example, a lower number of products exported by the firm, and a lower number of destination markets and product market destination relationship or diversity. At the same time, there is also a higher exposure to these NTMs is associated with lower firm level export values and quantities. And in almost all of these cases, we find that the effect of these of the NTM exposure exceeds the effects of the tariff exposure, which we also control for in the analysis. And this is consistent with a literature that was nicely summarized in this Erin Dodan Ruta paper, where they share that this has been found to be the case when looking at imports, and so we'll also find that this will be the case when looking at exports. So our key contributions from these findings are really twofold and speak to 2 broader strands of literature. The first is on the NTM literature, and here we contribute to the literature by overcoming, a challenge that I've mentioned already on the difficulty in collecting sufficiently comprehensive and sufficiently detailed data on NTMs, and then further linking that specifically to firms that trade in the products that are affected by those NTMs. So we overcome this literature or improve on previous data sets used in the literature by using this new time-varying NTM database that's at the most disaggregated NTM level and also the most disaggregated product level, and matched with the customs level data set of exporters. Then the other strands of literature is broadly on trade policy and exports. And here we can establish a causal relationship between NTMs and firms' export performance. And we can do this in sort of a new way by addressing NTMs as a trade policy tool, whilst in most literature has looked at import tariffs. So now looking at the data and then giving a little bit more detail on that. So we use 3 sets of data. The first 2 sets of data are the key data sets that we use. So the first is, this customs level database. So this database was confidentially shared to us by the Ministry of Finance through their agency called the Directorate General of Customs. And it's a monthly data on the universe of all the exporters between 2014 and 2018. And the second database is this NTM database. So this database was assembled by the team at the World Bank Jakarta, and it's assembled using comprehensive and extensive regulatory checks and built upon a database that was done by AREA. There's a little bit more detail on that in the appendix and in the paper, but essentially this database results in us having, all the possible, or at least as much as they are can be identified from the regulations, all of the regulations that exist on imports for Indonesia. So about 60 NTMs based on this classification that I mentioned earlier. We also use the Indonesian Manufacturing Survey, and this is the census of manufacturing firms in Indonesia that's conducted annually. But we don't use this in our main estimations, but more, to check for the mechanism through which this import competition channel could affect exports. So giving a little bit more preview to the data. So in terms of the exports, we have about nearly 23,000 individual exporting firms that are observed in this time period. And both data sets, as I mentioned, they are at the HS10 digit level. And what we do is then we link these data sets using the HS10 digit product that is affected by the NTM and the HS10 digit product that is exported by the specific each specific firm in the data. And I think then the key question is how we select the NTMs. As I've mentioned, that there's 60 of them in our data set. So how do we analyze? How do we choose sort of which ones to analyze? So we follow two sort of broad ways to do that. The first is we try to look at NTMs that fulfill three conditions that breach sort of key principles of WTO rules. And these are, regulations that they discriminate against imports. They may not necessarily achieve a non-trading objective, as we expect NTMs to do, and regulations that are likely to impose significant costs of imports. And then after looking at these regulations based on that, we also try to see how many of Indonesian firms are affected by these regulations. So using sort of these two ways to try to narrow down to NTMs that might be more trade restrictive, we end up with the 4 NTMs that I mentioned earlier. And to give a little bit more nuance to those that and perhaps further further clarify how they fit into these criteria that we looked at, I'll explain a little bit about each one. So first, pre-shipment inspection. With the pre-shipment inspections, shipments are expected to be inspected at the port of departure before leaving for Indonesia. But this measure, we argue that is pretty redundant, and because the customs agency applies a risk management system anyway that aims to detect the suspicious shipment at the border. So it doesn't need to be checked before leaving. And in this risk management system, the customs does not take into account the outcome of the pre-shipment measure inspection. So it's a pretty redundant measure that's not even feeding into this risk management system to detect suspicious shipments at the border. And it's also important to add here that very few countries still apply this PSI measure, certainly very few middle-income countries. The second is port of entry requirements, and this is where Indonesian regulations mandate that certain goods must go through designated ports of entry. And here we argue that ensuring safety of imported goods does not require those kinds of entry restrictions. The third is the SNI, and this is our mandatory certification with Indonesian product standards. This requires a visit to the factory premises by an Indonesian certifying agency. And granted, this is applied to both domestic and foreign goods, but you can imagine that the cost for foreign goods is significantly higher. And here our contention is that for each of, this is also a recurrent cost because this has to be renewed every year at a fee, and the process must be carried out every 3 or 4 years for certain types of products. So it also provides some level of uncertainty. And the process itself can become very, very unpredictable. And finally, we have import approval. And import approval is essentially where the Indonesian firm has to have a certificate of approval for them to import certain products. And here the process can be very cumbersome and the duration is often unpredictable. And there's a lot of discretion applied because you need to get recommendation letters from various ministries. And there's a lot of discretion applied by those ministries. And on top of that, the import quantity for which the approval is sought by the firm can differ from what the producer actually requested. And so based on these, of course, we'll go into a little bit more detail in the paper. We feel that not only do they fit in those categories of breaching those WTO or seemingly to breach some of those rules, but also these have very high sort of incidence rates, which I'll show in a minute. And then just looking at the data at firms, the distribution of the firms. Consistent with the literature, we find that exporting is concentrated and dominated by a few large firms in Indonesia. So, for example, the top 25 firms make up about 30% of export value in our period of analysis. And that's what we see in this pie chart here. And while the top 10 make up about 20% of export value. So this is out of nearly 23,000 firms in total. But the number of firms that have been trading or that have been exporting at least have been increasing in our time sample. And then looking at their destination and market characteristics, again, we see something quite consistent with sterilized facts in that single destination exporters represent a larger share of exporters, but a smaller share of export value. And multi-destination firms dominate in terms of export value. So that's the chart that we see where we have, single destination and single product firms making up about 70% of firms, but only, 10% of export value. Now, when we merge, the NTM data set and this firm data set, we then get a better picture of how these firms are then affected, or how many of these firms are affected by these NTMs. And as I mentioned, the way that we do this is by looking at whether or not the product a firm exports is subject to this NTM when that product is being imported. And we find that nearly half of all firms are affected, their products are affected by, for example, PSI measures and port of entry restrictions on average in the time sample that we have. And about 56% on average and nearly 30% for import approvals and SNI respectively. I thought I heard something. SNI respectively. So there we have the number of firms and the percentage share of firms affected by these 4 NTMs. So now moving on to the empirical strategy.
Hi, Angela. I just have a clarifying question. So on earlier slide, you said that around 25% exporters are subjected to these NTMs. Is it through competition channel or is it through their inputs? And in this data set, customs data set, can you actually see imports of each of these firms as well, or is it just export customs data? So these 2 questions.
So the first question is, here we are talking on in terms of this particular slide, we're talking about the competition channel. So they are affected in the sense that the product they export is subject to this NTM when that product is imported. And then to answer your second question, yes, we also observe importers and exporters in the case.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just delay my detailed questions for the end. Thank you.
Sure. Hmm. So for our empirical strategy, we formally define this firm level NTM exposure. And how we do that is we look at a product P in both data sets. And if in the NTM data set, this product is affected by an NTM, so the NTM that applies to that product is in effect in that particular month, we create a dummy where the NTM is equal to 1 if that if that NTM is in effect and 0 otherwise on that particular product. And then using this, we go to the exporter database, and what we do is then we link this to the products that the firm exports, but we want to get a sense of how important each of these products are to the firm. And how we do that is we have an invariant weight of export value for that specific product in firm I's exports in an invariant time period. So here we use the years 2014 and 2015, and then we multiply essentially that weight with this dummy. So it changes based on how much, or based on whether or not an NTM is in effect in a particular month for that particular product. And this NTM exposure is our key variable of interest. We use this invariant weight to try and account for sort of that the possible endogeneity, and so then our weight does not change alongside the NTM. And the way that we assess the firm performance.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
There's another question. I think it's better if it's answered now because it relates to what products you are considering, and it's better to know it now. So Evelyn has two questions.
Yeah.
So first one is, since you are considering only NTMs from the import side, would this mean that export products considered for the study are those that have high import content? And the second one is,
okay.
would SPS measures and TBTs not matter where the procedural obstacles are tied to those measures can be rather restrictive?
Okay, so I'm not sure I quite get the second one, but on the first question, so no, so we don't only consider export product with high import content. So remember that what we are trying to measure is this import competition for that good in the domestic market. So essentially, whether the exported product uses import content or not is not so relevant for our purposes. But what's relevant for our purposes is that the product being exported, there is less of it in the domestic market because of NTMs, and so that decreased competition or decreased concentration of that product in the domestic market. So we don't consider that import content aspect because, at least based on the channels we're thinking about, it does not play a role in this sort of relationship. And then the second question, I'm not sure I quite understand what the question is there on SPS and TBTs.
Evelyn, would you like, if this is a clarifying question, would you like to unmute and ask this, or we can also delay this till the end? So
Probably a very quick one. Thank you. I was thinking that, the intensity of SPS and TBT measures are rather high in ASEAN. Not sure, very sure the case of Indonesia, but in Malaysia, yes. So one of the assumptions was that you were looking at the measures that could be rather restrictive. And we find that a lot in the SPS and TBTs because they are packaged. They are not like tariffs, they come as a package. So there are a lot of procedures, let's say, to get an SPS certificate. So the procedures linked to the SPS measures can be rather restrictive. So overall, though they are not NTBs, they are NTMs, but they could have if procedures. So I was just wondering why that wasn't considered. Just a curiosity. Thank you.
Right. So we did consider that. So if you recall my slide on how we selected the measures, so two of the measures, so we are looking at a little bit more disaggregated measure of NTM. So our argument is that maybe just looking at SPS, for example, is very broad. And if we're talking to a policymaker, that includes lots of regulations. Even when we go to the level, this 3-digit level of, let's say, C1 pre-shipment inspection, even then there are several regulations that are included in this, just in this C1. So we do consider sort of that the process that it takes to comply to these kinds of NTMs, and why those may be burdensome to firms, but also even redundant in some cases. And that's sort of how we come up to these 4 specific measures that we look at. So if, as you know, C1 and C3, those are inspection measures, but B7 and B14, those are TBT measures. But for SPS measures, we felt that in general, yes, that the process might be cumbersome, and not everything that's, let's say, trade restrictive might be protectionist, quote unquote. So we felt that those measures in general normally do achieve, a legitimate non-trade objective. So let's say to protect consumer safety or health or the environment, etc. And so, and using sort of that, and also the amount, the incidence in Indonesia, we did not find that within SPS measures there were some that sort of fit this criteria that we were looking at that could be trade restrictive. I hope that sort of answers the question.
Thank you.
Right. Shall I continue, Shafat?
Yes, please.
Okay. So right. So this is how we this is our variable of interest at this firm level NTM exposure, and in our assessment of a firm export performance, we look at sort of look at it from three lenses. One is we do a survival analysis, so the firm's survival in the export market. And here our dependent variable is the log of time, essentially, and we look at how the various covariates, so this NTM exposure, but also other control variables that I will mention in the next slide, affect the firm's survival time. So we use this accelerated failure time model, but we also show results from a Weibull distribution model that applies this proportional hazards just to try to show the robustness to specification. And then the second lens is through the extensive margin. And here we look at the number of products, number of destinations, and the number of product destination pairs per firm. And since these are count products, we use a fixed effects Poisson on these dependent variables. Again, covariates being the key one is the NTM exposure, but also other controls that I'll talk about in a minute. And here we have both firm and time fixed effects. And on the intensive margin, our dependent variable are export values, firm export values and firm export quantities, where again we have these time and firm fixed effects and our variables of interest. And so to sort of talk about what are those covariates and how we address some threats to endogeneity given our assumptions for this model. So the NTM exposure is as I described in 2 slides before, the way we define it at the firm level for each exporter I. So that's our key variable of interest. But as I mentioned, we have other sort of NTMs, right, that are in effect in Indonesia, and hope maybe this also tries to answer the question that we just had. So we try to control for all of these other NTMs that are in effect at the same time, apart from our NTM of interest. So if we are looking at pre-shipment inspections, we control for all other measures, so SP, all other individual, so all the other 59 essentially. So whether they're part of SPS, TBT, etc., as long as they're in fact we control for that if the firm is also exposed to those. And then we have this tariff exposure, which is here not only to as a control, but because we are also interested to see whether the effect of tariff is worse than the effect of NTMs. And in this case, we also have a firm level exposure defined in the same way, but instead of a dummy for whether or not an NTM is in effect, we have the tariff rate. We we also try to account for possible indigeneity of NTMs. And in this case, we have the initial firm market share. So we get the value market share of each firm in its first month of exporting and interact that with our time fixed effects. And this also helps us control for the initial size of the firm or past performance of the firm. And then we have exporter and time fixed effects to try to address possible bias from reverse causality and any sort of unobservable variables that may be time invariant. So this initial firm market share and at HS10 level per firm tries to address any kind of time varying biases that may exist, and the fixed effects try to help us to address this time invariant possible bias and also some that might be commonly across all exporters. We do a few other things to try to show robustness and also address indigeneity, and I'll talk about those in a bit. So to try to get to the baseline results, first we present the results for the survival analysis, and on the left chart is the this accelerated failure time model, and on the right chart is a Weibull model which applies this proportional hazards. And on the left, what we are seeing is a percentage change in the survival time of the firm in the market for a 1% increase in the NTM exposure. And what we're seeing on the right is a change in the hazard rate for a 1% increase in NTM exposure. And in both cases, what we find is that an increase in a firm's exposure to NTMs, is associated with a lower survival time in the export market and is associated with a higher rate of exit. So on the left, which is sort of our baseline, and on the right is sort of a robustness, but in the literature on survival, most authors would show sort of both models. What this is saying is that if a firm's exposure increases by 1% to, let's say, port of entry requirements, then their survival time decreases by about 9 percentage points. In all cases, the effect of tariffs is significantly larger than that, and significantly lower than that of NTMs, with the exception of import approvals. We can see that here import approvals also have a quantitatively larger effect. And I need to mention here that ex ante, a priori rather, we do not have sort of an expectation of which NTM we think would have a larger effect than the other. We sort of are teasing that out in the data. When we look at the results from the baseline results from the extensive margin, where we're looking at number of products and number of destinations, again, we see that NTMs have a negative effect on product and market diversity, and again, a more adverse impact than tariffs. Here, the magnitude of the coefficients is quite a bit lower than, for example, what we see with the survival analysis. So this is a typo here. This two should be there. But here, what we see is that we can see that for 3 of the 4 NTMs, we see this negative effect. But for this SNI measure, we do not yet see sort of any an effect that is statistically different from 0, at least for both the number of products and the number of destinations, and also the number of product destination pairs, which we don't show here. And the third aspect of our baseline results is on the intensive margin. And here we find again that exposure to non-tariff measures negatively impacts firm values, and also negatively impacts quantities. In terms of magnitudes, there are quite similar on the values and the quantity side. So here we just show the effect on the values. And what this chart is telling us on the left side is the percentage change in a firm's export values from a 10% change in the increase in exposure. And on the right side, what we have is the coefficient from, or rather the percentage change from in firm exports from a 10% increase in tariff. But this is again, this is the coefficient in the regression that for that particular NTM. So then we compare those two. But essentially, the effect is greater for NTM than tariff in all of the 4 cases. In this case, we see that the sort of the port of entry regulations seem to have a higher, in terms of magnitude effect, or the higher magnitude effect compared to in the extensive margin regressions where that was the case for import approval. And again, here we don't have any specific expectations. So, if there's any sort of suggestions from the audience on this, on what can be expected, or we can be more sort of have a higher effect, we're happy to hear that. Now, in terms of the mechanism through which we think this can affect firms, we consider 3 sets of mechanisms. The first, and these were maybe sort of teased out a little bit in the introduction. The first is firms with higher markups in the export market. They may have less incentive to switch, even if the domestic market becomes more lucrative due to NTMs. So if that is true, what we expect is that the effect of NTMs on firms that may have higher markups may be less negative. So we still expect a negative effect, but it could be less negative for these kinds of firms. The second mechanism that we think about is firms that are trading in industries with higher economies of scale. So here we see that if firms might need exports to achieve scale, and as I had mentioned in the introduction, if there is joint economies of scale, then we might expect to see the opposite result, right? That lower competition actually improves exports or vice versa. So if true, what we expect is that NTMs on firms which are in these kinds of industries may be less negative. And then finally, we also look at firms that export more frequently. So we think that firms that export more frequently may have higher sunk costs. And if this is true, then they may have longer survival time in the market. So what we do to try to tease out these mechanisms is to calculate proxies for each of them. So for markup, the proxy that we use is unit values. So here, we do not observe the domestic activities of these firms, right? So we are using the information that we have from this customs data set. So we proxy that using unit values. And then we frequent exporters, and we simply take firms that export more frequently than the median value. And then for increasing returns to scale, we estimate that using this method by Alkenbeck and Caves, and that we have a we calculate a 95% interval of where we add or we estimate the capital plus labor. And then we have a dummy for that, which is equal to 1 if it is increasing returns to scale, and it's 0 if it's constant or decreasing returns to scale. Again, we have a little bit more detail on that in the appendix. And then all of these are dummies that interact with the NTM exposure variable. And what we find from these 3 sets of mechanisms is that first we find some support for the first mechanism, so that's the markup mechanism. So we find that the impact of NTMs on survival time is less negative for firms that have higher unit value. So that's the first panel that we see here. At least for 2 of the 4 NTMs. For the other NTMs, we do not really find evidence for that, but we do find some evidence that yes, firms with, with higher markups seem to have a little bit longer survival times. And then for the other extensive margins, again, we also find that the impact of NTMs on those is also less negative, generally less negative for firms with high unit values. But we do not find evidence for this when we look at the intensive margin of trade. Okay. So then, and in terms of our economies of scale mechanism, we find that firms that are operating in markets with higher returns to scale are more negatively affected on both the extensive and intensive margins, but they seem to have longer survival times. And for firms that export more frequently, the results are a little bit mixed across, the different margins. Okay, and then we do a bunch of exercises for robustness, so alternative specification for the survival and also for the extensive margin. We also do run all of these specifications using the aggregate NTM measures that that's usually done in the literature, and we try to actually make the case that we need to get a little bit more disaggregated than these broad measures. And we also conduct a robustness exercises where we drop sort of the top 1% of firms in terms of export values. And we find that, our results remain consistent across sort of these checks. So let me close here because it's now 45. So to conclude, we find evidence that through, reduced import competition and increase in NTM exposure negatively affects the survival time of firms in the export market, the number of products they export to, the number of markets they export in, and also the values and quantities per firm. These negative effects are, in most cases, higher than the effect of tariffs, and we see these results as sort of a first step that can help policymakers to properly target export promotion activities, especially in a country like Indonesia, and where policymakers are interested in sort of this export-led growth and diversification. And some of the recommendations that are coming out that are really based on how the measures are applied, and that we are finding some evidence of this negative effect is to have some targeted elimination of measures such as apportionment inspection and port of entry requirements, which we argue that are unnecessary, and streamlining of other measures such as the import approval, potentially replacing it with automatic licenses, with exceptions to specific products, and for these national standards to be done by third-party verification to be more self-certification for non-high-risk products, based on what other countries have done. And finally, I would talk about our limitations. And here the limitation is that we do not explicitly measure competition in the domestic market, but we rely on existing theoretical and empirical evidence on market concentration and export performance. And these are usually at some broad level of analysis and perhaps a little bit more disaggregated than what we have done. We would have to trace an HS product to the domestic market to understand the mechanism on which our channel relies on. And since we do not have this customs and manufacturing data linked, I mentioned that we had this survey data, but this data is not linked to our customs data, so we cannot match firms in those two data sets, at least at this point. We cannot observe these details. Nevertheless, we feel that these findings are a first step in highlighting the important channel through which domestic policies can affect firms in the international market and open the door for further research, including research on the input supply channel. So that would sort of fit into an earlier question on input input in the export products. So we think that this, it opens the door for that kind of research. Right. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela, for a very clear and interesting presentation. I'm sure there may be other questions as well, but I would like to start the Q&A with my questions. But before I do that, I am just posting the survey link for today's seminar. I would appreciate it if the participants can fill this out. It's very short and it will help us improve our quality of seminars. So let me begin with my questions. So I have three main questions. First one is that the strength of the exercise that you are, there's two factors of there's two main strengths of the exercise that you're showing. First is that you have good disaggregated data on trade, and the second one is that you have very good disaggregated data on NTMs. So I'm sure not a lot of researchers would have access to that. So it would be nice to, as someone who does not have access to it, I would have liked to see how your results look at a higher aggregation of products, for example. Now, even if the results are in line with your disaggregated results or not, it will be an interesting finding because you can either show that you may not need such disaggregated data to find these effects, or you show that you actually need this, both of which are very important to know. So it would be interesting to see this at a different, for example, HS6, which is very widely available.
Right.
Then I know you have firm level as well, so maybe there's some way to bring this at HS6 level, which would be interesting, which is very readily available. Secondly, I think your results, when you explore further into the mechanisms, are very interesting. Sometimes they don't line up with my prior, but that's even more interesting. But I think, but my suggestion, well, I just have one suggestion. When you look at the markups, instead of unit values, which may have a lot of noise, I would like to suggest that if you're using unit values, you can maybe control for industry year fixed effects, which will control for some sort of marginal costs while you're looking at unit values. But I think a better measure could be if you just use elasticity estimates from other papers like Broda and Weinstein, then because we know that lower elasticities are associated with higher markups. So you can look at the demand elasticities for these goods to get some sense of markups on these products. And the last one is about the input effects. I think so. I was first trying to relate the coefficients on tariff exposure to trade elasticities, but that's not the way maybe to think about it, because these are tariffs on the products, on the output products of firms. So these are not on the tariffs on the inputs of the firms, as I understand it. So that's why I think it makes sense to me. But I think so what I see is that as you increase tariffs on the output products of a firm, your exports go down, which may be coming mostly from productivity channel. And we know from papers like Amity and Konings that even tariffs on your outputs reduce your productivity. But I think you do have data on, as I asked during the presentation, you do have very good data on inputs as well. So because the literature finds much larger effects from your trade barriers on inputs, on productivity, it would be nice to complement it with the effects on exports, which may or may not be driven through productivity, but because literature finds higher effects for inputs, it would be nice to see that. And you do have tools and data to do that. So that would be something interesting to do. We can also collect more questions if there are, or if there aren't any, then you may proceed with answering these. Well, it's up to you, however you want to do this.
I mean, we can collect more. I don't have specific answers because you've given us suggestions, which I agree with. On the more aggregated level, so yes, we do estimates on the aggregated NTM level, but we don't do on the aggregated product level. So I think that's definitely something that would be nice to do, and just sort of to show whether it justifies or makes this a little bit less necessary. So I agree there. And also, yes, I agree. I think on the industry effects effects, this is something that we intend to do. And you're absolutely right. So, in essence, I agree with all of your observations, and it's something that we will look at. I think on the input side, right. So initially we wanted this paper to tackle both, but I think that then we were already sort of looking at all of these margins and then this channel and sort of then getting, analyzing the literature there and then looking at that channel. So that's why we sort of thought that we can look at the input channel side, sort of in a separate discussion, so that it doesn't crowd what is feeling like quite an already dense piece of writing. But you're absolutely right, and most of the papers look at that input channel. But in a sense, it's also a motivation for us to look at this competition channel, because it's not something that's done a lot, and certainly not with NTMs. But that's definitely on the cards. And if you have more suggestions on how to go about that, we're very open.
Thanks for your comments. If there are any questions from our audience, please unmute yourself and ask them. Okay, I think we can maybe wait for people. So, but in the meantime, I can ask another question I had, which was because I think you are running these regressions at the monthly frequency.
Yes.
So I was wondering how, if you're controlling for just whenever we go very disaggregated, more disaggregated than the annual level, there is this problem of seasonality and lumpiness. So seasonality is, I think, is a common one with all economic variables, but lumpiness is more of a problem with trade, because we see these large infrequent shipments most of the time. And I see that you have done some work with frequency of shipments, but is there any way, because if you don't see a shipment for a few months, that may not mean that there is a negative effect on trade. It just means that people are stocking up, and then some goods we expect to see more of this and some goods less. So like a second part to this question is that you identify firms as high frequency or low frequency, but it really is, I think, product level characteristic of frequency. So would like to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, correct. So yes, our frequency is defined purely at the firm level. So we just see whether or not they export, regardless of what product they export. But I think, yeah, maybe a way to try to do that, we could also then define frequency, considering at the product level, and then see sort of if this still holds. So that's yeah, I think that we didn't consider this. Yeah, and we have the data, so we can easily do that. Have that frequency at the firm product level, and then see what happens.
Yeah, I think one way to control for lumpiness is if you just on the explanatory variable, if you also control, for example, the time lapse between last shipment and the size of last shipment. These could be very reduced form ways to control for it. But there's other ways to also smooth out the trade flow so that you don't your regressions don't capture the inventory level movements, the high frequency movements. And I think we can talk about it after this session as well.
Sure. Sure.
So if there aren't any questions, I think I can proceed and end this formally, the seminar. And if you have more questions, if anybody thinks of a question afterwards, please reach out to Angela. And so, yeah, so I think formally we can end this. for now. Thank you very much,
Sure.
everyone, for participation. Thank you. Thanks. A big thanks to Angela for her presentation. I learned a lot there.
Yeah. No, thank you for having me. Yeah. Happy to hear from anyone who may have more suggestions.
Okay, so I think if anyone has any comments, you can stay here. I hope Angela you have time for a few minutes for
Sure,
discussion.
sure. Yeah, sure.
Give me 1 second.
Sure. So, are we still streaming?
Right, that's what I'm checking. I think Stella, we can maybe end the streaming and recording.
Yeah, sure. I will do that now. And I will leave the meeting. Yeah, Shafan, I will give you the host role.
Okay.
Angela, thank you for a great presentation. All the best to
Thank you.
you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Hope to see you someday in Malaysia
Yeah,
because you're not
me
far from
too.
here. You're still in the same region.
Definitely, me too.
Yeah.
You sound so
Yeah.
nice. I look forward
Yeah.
to meeting you. See you later.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Bye.